Hello, everybody. I'm about to do a some comments on a book by Dinesh D'Souza called "End of Racism." He starts. One of the things he mentions is Cordelia and King Lear, and he talks about free blacks in the Dred Scott decision. Now, the Dred Scott decision involved a black that had escaped from slavery or had his free papers and didn't want to be enslaved. And the Supreme Court determined that there were no rights that a black man should respect. Now, I've heard Dinesh in a movie say that Dr. Henry Louis Gates had said that there was about as many blacks owning slaves as whites. Now, I think in terms of why they would have a Dred Scott decision and other things, that doesn't add up. Now, I'm fully aware that some blacks did own some slaves. Now, they said here that Jefferson did not buy into the notion of the happy slave. I don't quite recall what the significance of that is, but Jefferson did try to put something in the Declaration of Independence condemning slavery, and he had written that he fully understood that it was wrong and not good, even though he had slaves himself. Let's see. Teddy Roosevelt had said there should be no hyphenated Americans. He said a hyphenated American is not truly an American. Now, of course, it's commonplace these days to call U.S. blacks African Americans. I had mentioned to someone on a job that I was American. He says, no, you are African American. But I've also had Africans from Africa tell me that everyone else was proud of where they came from and hyphenated themselves. And when you fill out forms, they don't mention a lot of hyphenated people. It'll say white, Latino, Hispanic, black, etc. So at least in terms of the official forms, that's not what they promote. Let's see. In 1924, it says that there were restrictions placed on immigration. In one of the quotes and headings of one of the chapters, he mentioned an African writer called Chinua Achebe, who I believe one of his big works was Things Fall Apart, and some other book, but I read that in high school, so it really did help to jog my memory to see that by Chinua Achebe. Let's see. Now, he talks about the Afrocentric scholars, and he mentioned Chancellor Williams, Molefe, Asante, Dr. John Henrik Clark, and others, and he quotes archaeologists, anthropologists to say that their notions of a lot of the Egyptian culture coming from U.S. blacks was not correct, and the notion that the Greeks got much of what they did from U.S. blacks not being correct. Now, ironically enough, one of the people that he had cited was Mary Lefowitz, who wrote a very popular book called Not Out of Africa, where she disputed a lot of the Afrocentric claims. But there is a YouTube video where she debated Dr. John Henrik Clarke, and he seemed to basically wipe the floor with her. Now, that doesn't mean that nothing that she has written has any merit, but at least in that debate, Dr. Clarke seemed to get the best of her, and he had went as far as to tell her that she needed to read more before she could debate with him. Let's see. One of the anthropologists that he mentioned to dispute the Afrocentrics was Frank Yurko, Y-U-R-C-O. Then he was saying that Egypt was ruled by what is now Ethiopia, but they were Nubians, one of the claims of this book. Let's see. He claims that Frank Snowden says that when the Afrocentrists say that Kemet is a word for black, that it is referring to the fertile soil. And he mentioned that some of the pictures that had black features were supposedly because some of the people were in the sun. Now, in the 5th chapter of the Song of Solomon, it says, I am black but comely, and some have said that that had to do with being in the sun as well. He mentions archaeologist Kathy Bard. To support what he has to say. He says there's no evidence for a lot of the claims of the Afrocentrics, and he mentions Ivan van Sertima in particular. And all of this is in the chapter called Is Eurocentric Ideas Racist? He mentioned that the Greeks were considered the founders of Western civilization. He poo-poos the notion, Dinesh D'Souza in his book, poo-poos the notion that Napoleon had shot off the nose of a black pyramid because it looked too much like a black man. He deals with ancient Ptolemy II, found the Library of Alexandria after Aristotle's death, which is what he is using to try to say that those that said that Aristotle had learned from blacks was not correct. Now, Ptolemy, I believe, was one of the lieutenants of Alexander the Great. And they said that there was a New York Times review of Ivan van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus that basically dismissed what he had to say. And he questioned whether many of the people that the Afrocentrics claim are black were in fact black, such as Cleopatra. He talked about the ISIS papers, which he said was a Afrocentric bestseller, and that it had sold about 40,000 copies. Now, one of the things that he neglected to mention was that Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, the author, was a psychiatrist, which means that she did have an MD, and she certainly should know something about genetics. Now, he talks about the early times of the Nation of Islam and said that Wali Fard Muhammad was a mulatto who had claimed he came from, I guess, somewhere in the Middle East, but I had heard that his racial background was not clear. It says here that he was a convicted drug dealer and door-to-door raincoat salesman. He mentioned that him and Elijah Muhammad had founded a second temple, and then that Wallace Fard Muhammad disappeared, and Elijah Poole, who wound up calling himself Elijah Muhammad, took over from that point. He also had mentioned that this Wallace Fard Muhammad was influenced by Marcus Garvey, where I know that Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad were, but if I knew about this Wallace Fard Muhammad, I forgot that. Were influenced by Marcus Garvey, who was a businessman who advocated a Back to Africa movement and was eventually convicted of mail fraud and deported back to Jamaica. He mentioned that, he said that Farrakhan had said that Malcolm X had deserved to die because of his disloyalty to Elijah Muhammad. Now, I understand the government was doing all kinds of things to create dissension and resentment within the Nation of Islam within that regard, but there are numerous videos of Malcolm X on YouTube where he had been interviewed on TV, and when he was exposing Elijah Muhammad's personal business pertaining to sex with secretaries and things of this nature, that he said he was probably a dead man already. Now, I saw and have told people, and they have told me that they don't believe it or they're just questioning it, where Farrakhan did say that no one man is above an organization and that Malcolm X deserved to be taken out of the grave and put back in there. So it was interesting to see that Dinesh D'Souza was saying that Farrakhan said that Malcolm X deserved to die for being disloyal to Elijah Muhammad. Now, Farrakhan sometimes makes speeches and references Malcolm X. He calls him Brother Malcolm X. He has talked to Malcolm X's daughter. So there, I don't know. It just seems to be a little bit of a dichotomy or whatever there. He mentioned Sam Yet, a Howard professor, who I recall that the late Bernie McCain, who on WL they called the dean of talk radio, used to mention Sam Yet and a book that he had written. So that I found that interesting. Um, so I guess that's more or less about it now. This was a very long book and it had a lot of information in it. I skimmed quite a bit of it, but I'm sure if you read it, you'll find it worthwhile.